My name is Sam, my pronouns are they, them, and this is my Here Life Comes story. I grew up in Kuching, Sarawak, which is the Malaysian region of the island of Borneo. I always grew up with this really big sense of community and close-knit community, which I love. I'm a very community-oriented person. Obviously, we're also here talking about identity. It was not the safest space to grow up queer, so that was something I only really started to explore publicly, freely, when I moved out of home. We're at La Rocca, my favorite climbing gym in Naarm in Melbourne, and I've been coming here consistently for about 18 months. It's just a place where I feel really safe, really included, very valued. It's such a special space. Climbing Cuties is a queer climbing community and an advocacy organization specifically for LGBTQIA+ youth and/or members of the climbing community. I learned about Climbing Cuties by kind of happening upon a random meetup, kind of very quickly fell in love with it. They did a call out for new board members, anybody who wanted to contribute. They made a note about wanting some help with marketing specifically. I'm a marketer, and so I was like, please, let me be a part of this. I want to help introduce this to more queer people looking for spaces that I was looking for. And I've been on the board for a couple years now. I believe the definition of non-binary is to identify not exclusively either as a man or as a woman. One, I absolutely 100% relate to that definition. But beyond that, I think I also view being non-binary in terms of not having a binary way of thinking about life. So I tend not to be too black and white when it comes to the ways by which I'm constrained, the decisions that I make, the limitations that I place on myself. And yes, being non-binary is predominantly about my gender expression, but it is also in the way that I see the world. Yeah, I mean, the best part of coming out as NB and stepping into essentially who I am is that being seen, being known, being loved. You're always going to feel a degree of compromise between being known and being loved. I definitely do feel that in certain spaces, but by and large, being able to come out as non-binary has meant that my relationships are fuller, they're closer. I would say I feel the most loved that I've ever felt in my life. To a degree, I also feel the most vulnerable that I've ever felt in my life because I'm sharing myself as openly and honestly as I can. But I also do think, unfortunately, those two things come hand in hand. How can you be known and seen and loved if you're not able to make yourself vulnerable? Being a member of the queer community, not everybody is going to have the luxury of being able to be vulnerable. In some cases, that compromise is necessary. I feel really fortunate that a lot of my life, I do not need to make those compromises. If you are a queer person, then you know this experience, which is that you are essentially just trying to explore and become who you are. And there is a lot of stigma and a lot of negative and harmful and dangerous discourse around what that means for other people. It doesn't make sense to me, or this is immoral to me. One of the most critical things about supporting any marginalized person, queer or otherwise, is reckoning with your own discomfort. Being able to prioritize creating safety and creating a safe environment for somebody else who's experiencing unsafety, even if the price is you being uncomfortable. Because ultimately, you being uncomfortable is not going to be equivalent to somebody else's lack of safety. One of the greatest challenges has honestly just been a lack of understanding and/or intentional misunderstanding, and either a lack of curiosity or kindness in that curiosity. So much of the labor of being known and being understood is placed onto queer people while they're already having a difficult enough time understanding themselves, let alone representing that to others. So there are organizations like Minus 18. They are an advocacy and educational group, particularly for queer youth in Australia. And they share incredible educational resources, not just around gender diversity, but also wider queer experiences and how to support queer youth. How important is community? I think community is paramount. I think about all of the things that have led to this point, for example, whether it's been the support that I've experienced in community or in friendship or in family, whether it's through organizations like Climbing Cuties or spaces third spaces like La Rocca, where I feel included and valued and safe. I don't think that I would have been able to get to a point where I can speak confidently on who I am as a person, inclusive of my gender identity, if I didn't have those things. if I persisted in existing in isolation. I just don't think it would have been possible for me to get to this point. So if I had to give advice to people navigating a big life change, first big thing is be kind to yourself. I know that it is easier said than done, but life is messy. More often than not, the examples that you have for big life changes are the post-production, post-edit, the clean version where it's either a big success story or a big failure. And the second would be taking your time. There's literally no manual, there's literally no instruction book on how to live a life well lived, of how to learn about yourself and how to be a person. You get to set what that journey looks like, and if you're lucky, you have examples of what that could be around you, but take your time. Nobody's rushing you, and you shouldn't rush yourself.